Welcome everyone to another live stream. So I hope everyone is doing well. Um, Everything's working, it looks like. So I hope everyone's doing well. Today is an interesting one. We are looking at something, same general topic, but something slightly different. It's designer babies, as they're called. The sort of, technology that's somewhat already in use, but is becoming and will become, more intricate, more powerful, and carry with it more ethical questions than it does at the moment. And, essentially being able to like manipulate your, you know, future child's DNA, basically. And genes. So welcome Louis, welcome Vegan Games and Zuza. I think Zuza is new. Vegan Games, I think I've maybe seen you here a couple of times, but Zuza I think is new. So welcome to the chat. If you're watching already, which you obviously are if you're hearing this, do say hello in the chat. It's always nice to see who's watching. Hey, Bravis as well is in the chat. So everything seems to be coming through fine, but I'm being told that there's no data. But I think YouTube is lying to me. What I'll say is just YouTube seems to be lying to me at the moment, but if there are any issues or anything like that, just put it in the chat with audio or video or anything. And I'll be keeping an eye on the chat. But yeah, YouTube seems to be taking me for a mug at the moment. Welcome to the chat, Suman, as well. So what are we doing today? So basically today, I'll do a very quick bit of intro and then we'll get into it. So basically, The Spectator is originally they were a magazine. Sort of do like, political commentary, stuff like that, current affairs. And they also have like a YouTube channel, and I'm sure they have a range of podcasts and stuff. And they have this thing called Spectator TV as well, which I don't actually know if it's a TV channel in the UK, but it's at least on, it's called the Spectator TV on their YouTube. So they recently did a conversation between the host, who I'm not sure what her name is, but between the host, Louise Perry, and Mary Harrington. So I can just give a very brief introduction to Louise Perry and Mary Harrington, and I'm probably going to butcher what they stand for. But basically, very, very brief overview is they both, to my understanding, I'm more like familiar with Louise Perry than I am Mary Harrington. But Mary Harrington seems to go by, she sort of calls herself a regressive feminist, I think it was, or reactionary feminist. But Louise Perry is more about sort of like questioning where society has gone and sort of evolving cultural norms or societal norms, and how they sort of affect and disadvantage women, basically. So I know she talks a lot about the pill. She talks about modern dating culture, stuff like this. So yeah, I think as far as I'm understanding, I think they're both sort of leaning on the cultural conservative side, but I might be wrong in that. Anyway, so they're having a discussion about designer babies, and I started to watch it yesterday because I just saw it come up. And I started to watch it, and I thought, actually, you know what? I have a bit of, I think it would be good to do like a live stream about this. So I have already done a video before on designer babies, and, sort of, obviously I'm talking about it from an anti-natalist perspective, and like how I see the moral panic about designer babies, sort of taking off the mask to some of the things we take for granted and accept in general procreation. I have done a whole video on that, which I have already linked in the description. So you can go and check that out after this stream. But I'm going to cover like a few very basic like intro points before we get into the actual clip that I cover in much more detail in the actual video. So a few of the sort of observations I made along the lines that I was just talking about, which, you know, other people may have further observations they want to add. So the main thing that designer babies is trying to get at, like the positive case for it, is essentially that you're not leaving things up to nature. You're not leaving things up to chance. And there are certain things that you wouldn't want to leave up to chance, right? Like, you know, their risk of certain diseases or whatever. And then there's also the case of, you know, like there's the designer baby case of reducing potential harm, but then there's also the designer baby case of like increasing potential benefits. So one potential harm would be reducing the risk for like cancer, for example. But then the case for positive benefit would be like, you know, I'm gonna make my child more intelligent or more handsome, or, you know, I don't know, have blonde hair because they're perceived as more attractive, or whatever. You get the point. So I think like that very case, which is why the case is being made by proponents of designer babies, recognizes the fact that, as David Pearce calls it, like general procreation is just like a genetic crapshoot. Like, it's not completely random, obviously, because you've got two specific parties who have genetic material that's coming together. Now, there's a wide range of possibilities for what that child's genetic makeup will mean for their experience of their life. But it's obviously not, it's limited in some ways. So they're not going to be born as an elephant, for example. But within the spectrum of possibilities, there's quite a large range for very bad lives, an average life, and an above average life, you know, a very good life. And yeah, it's as David Pearce says, like the fact that designer baby technology is even like proposed or a thing, recognizes the fact that general procreation, which is the vast majority of procreation that has ever and does happen now, is just the genetic crapshoot. Like, you're essentially saying, I want a baby and I will just completely, you know, within the biological bounds, but completely like unrestricted in terms of, I'm not going to do like specific things to try and mitigate, when we're talking about genetics, mitigate this child's, ill-being, them falling foul of potential harms. It's essentially like you're just running a biological experiment with an unconsenting test subject, right? So that's one point. It sort of recognizes implicitly, or maybe even explicitly, some people recognize that, like, look, no, we need designer babies because general procreation is just, there's an unacceptable level of risk for that child. And that brings me on to the next thing, right, is that risk. So I'm going to keep talking while I take my jumper off because it's actually getting quite hot. So yeah, the bit about risk. So when you are proposing, designer baby technology, you're essentially saying there are certain risks that I see as intolerable or close to intolerable, risks that I want to reduce. And those could be, we just take an easy example, a risk of cancer, right? I see the risk of cancer that my child that I'm going to create, will be exposed to is intolerable. So I want to use this technology to bring that risk down. And I don't know the empirics on this. I don't know what level the technology is at for, in terms of like how far it can bring the risk down. But just the fact that the technology is used to reduce risk, again, implicitly or often explicitly recognizes that there is risk in procreation, right? So it then, then occurs to me. So, okay, so you have a child, let's say they have a 1 in 10 risk of getting cancer. In reality, it's much higher than that. But let's say they have a 1 in 10 risk of getting cancer. I'm going to use genetic, manipulation, designer baby technology to bring that risk down to, let's say, 5%, half it, which is, it's a good wallop, half in the risk of something. Like, from my perspective, that's still an intolerable risk. Why do you have the right to create someone else who you know very little about? They're a complete other different human being. Why do you get why is it your moral right to create that person and impose that risk of cancer? And we're just talking about cancer. Like, there's all of the other harms in life that you're rolling the dice on them for. Even if the dice you're rolling with designer baby technology, the magnitudes of the harms are lesser, you're still imposing those harms on them. And also, at least at the moment, we don't have designer baby technology to be able to like reduce every harm, right? So designer baby technology also, for me, brings in that whole thing of like, there's a genetic, creating someone brings with it inherent risk. And even if you reduce that risk, why is it up to you to impose like any level of risk on someone who, they don't even exist? You're just creating them because you want to, and you're imposing that risk on them of something horrible like cancer, which none of us would want to ever, have that happen to our child. And yeah, I mean, it brings to mind the David Benatar quote of like, it's curious how, I'm going to butcher the quote, but it's curious how, smart people go to great lengths to avoid their child coming to any harm, not realizing that the one and only guaranteed way of them befalling any harm is not to create them in the first place. Kind of like it smacks of that. And the third sort of thing I'll note on before we actually start the video is this idea of like procreation being seated in like a selfish desire, right? It's self-serving. So one of the criticisms levied at designer baby technology is that, when you get to the point where you're, starting to alter how your child is going to be in terms of like they're good at piano or they're blonde or eye color and stuff like that, this is just, it's a selfish pursuit because you're designing the child how you want. You're supposed to be creating the child, for the child's sake, which doesn't make sense because they don't exist to want to come into existence. But, this just goes to show how much of a selfish pursuit it is because you're designing them like a doll, how you want it. It's all about you, blah, blah, blah. And I can understand that sentiment, but that also carries over to general procreation. Like, who is not creating a child to pursue their own interests? Like, first of all, it doesn't make sense to create someone for their own benefit, right? They don't exist to want to come into existence, right? They're not out there, like Ricky Gervais says, they're not like some ghost fetus clawing to get into existence. You just created them because you wanted to. You had some desire that you wanted to satiate, to satisfy, and you created someone to that end, right? So you're using them as a means to your own ends, which if anything is selfish, then you can call that selfish, right? So especially when it's imposing harm on the person that you're creating to satisfy your own desires. Buddha's in the chat, bringing it back after all those years. Yeah, so those are a few things I wanted to sort of note on in general about designer baby technology and how I think it sort of raises some questions about general procreation. But I've got a video that I've already gone through all of that in much more detail. It's linked in the description. You can have a look at it later. But we will start now. So before we go on to the actual video, I'll just say hello to everyone who's come into the chat. So Suman, I'm not sure if I said hello or not, but welcome to the chat. Joe, welcome to the chat. Anonymous, welcome to the chat. Dylan, welcome to the chat. Etruska, and Buddha. I think that's everyone for now. And Raphael as well. Raphael from Vienna. I was recently in Vienna. Vienna. I think I was mixing up Vienna with Viagra then. What was I saying? So, yeah, I was recently in Vienna with Nimrod, who did a European tour recently. If you look back, it's probably like 4 or 5 videos back now. There's some outreach videos from Vienna. Anyway, so let's get on to the actual video. So this is the host. Again, I forget her name. I'm sorry about that, or I'm not sure I actually ever knew her name. But yeah, let's begin and let's see what they say.
So welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Mary Wakefield, commissioning editor of the magazine. And we had a piece in this week's edition of The Spectator, a fascinating piece about the fact that technology will soon allow us to select for certain traits in our children. And I'm joined by the author of the piece, Louise Perry, the author and podcaster, and Mary Harrington, the reactionary feminist and philosopher, here to discuss the piece. Louise.
Okay, so apparently the audio is low. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my audio down. So I should be quieter now. If you boost your volume, I should now be more balanced with the clip. So yeah, hopefully it's better now. Cool. But at the end of the day, this is the volume of the original video, so I can't really do much. Maybe we can all email the Spectator, tell them to whack the volume up on their original videos.
This technology is already with us and available for parents to use, but we're not talking here about actually tinkering with DNA, are we? We're talking about polygenic screening. Could you tell us a little about the technology?
Right, so it's not CRISPR, which some listeners will be familiar with, which is where, you actually go in and you change genes. CRISPR is fairly scary, certainly from my perspective as a would-be consumer, because you just don't know what you might end up doing to the genome as a whole, and it's very experimental at this stage. What we're talking about here is actually something quite a lot less.
Yeah, well, so this is another point, right? So, like, I'll bring myself back up. So, it's like, people go to such, like, the things that people will do to try and make themselves feel better about creating someone and opposing that initial harm on them, right? Like, you create someone, create them into a world where there are massive harms that can befall them. There will be many harms that do befall them, and they will die at some point as well. And people are trying to sort of like scramble to try and find these like technologies or other such things that will try and reduce the harms on their child that they've imposed on them in the first place, right? And it's like, okay, so now we've got this technology of genetic manipulation, and it's like that may subdue the right word, sort of pacify some level of harm, but it also introduces a level of uncertainty where there may be, or it introduces the possibility for negative externalities, right? Unintended consequences. Now, I don't think unintended consequences, or the risk of unintended consequences, negative ones, should always hold us back from doing something. But if there's no need to create this person, like they don't exist to want to come into existence, we are just creating them because we want to, right? Not because it's a necessity, right? They're not losing out on anything if they don't exist, because there's no one who exists to lose out on anything, right? Imposing that harm on them and then trying to reduce it, and through trying to reduce it, we, then introduce the possibility of negative externalities. This just makes no sense. Just don't create them in the first place. Then there's no potential victim to befall any of these harms, right? These horrible things like, cancer, which is so common and like fucking horrible. Like, why just create them? Why create them in the first place? It makes no sense to me. It's creating someone who will befall harm and then try to mitigate the harm that will befall them. And it's just like, which don't create the opportunity in the first place. If you don't create them, they're not losing out. There's not this whole sad thing of like, they could have had such a good life. It's like, no, 1,000 years ago, I didn't exist. Was there a reason to go, 1,000 years ago, Lawrence wasn't having a good life? No, I didn't exist. It doesn't make any sense. And it's the same for people who don't exist now, who we could create. Like, we could create them, but they don't exist to want to come into existence. And if we don't create them, We're not doing anything wrong by not creating them. There's no harm being done to them, right? They don't exist. Everyone needs to chill. They don't exist. The only way they exist is as a figment of your imagination, just in the abstract right now. Yeah, and it's just like, why continue to create them and then try, to develop these technologies to then mitigate it? Do you get what I mean? It's the same as like anesthetic. It's like, for thousands and thousands of years, people sustained injuries and had to undergo some form of rudimentary or maybe even more complex operation without anesthetic. Now we have anesthetic, and it's good for people who exist that we have anesthetic, because it reduces the amount of pain they're going to be going through in certain circumstances. But it doesn't make sense to create someone so that they can benefit from anesthetic, right? Because the only reason they would need anesthetic is because they existed in the first place, and they have some issue they need to, resolve, harm they need to mitigate. It's the same with designer baby technology. Why create, like, given someone exists or like will exist, right? If someone's going to exist and we have no control over it at all, it's good. Well, this is the case of the designer baby people, but they would say it's good that this technology exists so that we can alleviate some of the harm that will befall them at some point in their life, right? And we can improve their chances of having a good quality life. That's obviously a good to the person who exists or will exist. But if you've got the choice of whether to create someone or not, that is not a reason that counts in favor of creating them. Do you get what I mean? So it's like, why are we constantly creating these people and then trying to clean up the mess, basically, that we've created for them? Just don't create them in the first place. But anyway, I know you guys have all heard that before.
Scientifically not very dramatic, but socially potentially very dramatic, where you do IVF as standard. It's already the case that embryos are screened through the IVF process. So the kind of basic screening for things like Down syndrome and some other traits which have been very easy to identify for a long time. What polygenic screening does is it allows you to screen for more things and for more complex things. So currently you can screen for things like risk of schizophrenia, height, intelligence. That's one of the most controversial ones. There's this whole list of things that you can screen for. Many of them straightforwardly are diseases, but there are also other things which aren't really related to disease, which are more sort of lifestyle-y.
Yeah, and
right,
as the technology...
Yeah, so this is the sort of distinction between like mitigating harms and attempting to bestow benefits, right? If you're just looking at it in terms of, the harms and benefits accrued to the child, if you're, or the future child, obviously there is then the angle of like, well, you could be doing these things to make your life easier, to benefit you because, you prefer this type of child or whatever. But when we're talking about things that, harms that can be mitigated or benefits that can be accrued to a future child, look, if someone is going to exist, like they will exist, this is now not a question that antinatalism really has anything to say on, right? Like antinatalism, as like an ethic, it kind of, for it to apply, there needs to be like choice, right? Well, it can still recognize that coming into existence is a harm, but for the moral condemnatory aspect of it, like the moral judgment, that requires choice. So if we just assume, there's a being that is going to come into existence, some woman is pregnant on the other side of the world, there's no way we're going to have any contact with her, blah, 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 then that kid is going to exist. And if we have some technology where we can reliably and safely, mitigate some harms that could befall them, like cancer, or I think she said schizophrenia, and we could maybe bestow some benefits onto them that in pretty much any situation would be, it would be furthering their interests, right? So like one thing could be like increasing the hedonic set point. So they still have a range of feelings and emotion, but it's just on average higher, so they don't have as lower lows, right? So, but they're still like information sensitive and stuff. In theory, this, this would be like very good, because we would be we would be sort of like pacifying some of the harms of coming into existence. In reality, it's more complicated because, like she said, there are many, unintended consequences that could happen. What if this technology is, it falls into the hands of some bad actor or some sort of, terrorist or rogue state or something like that, or a bad, company or whatever. These are obviously all valid concerns, but in theory, if we have some tool at our disposal to be able to alleviate some of the harms of coming into existence, then I see no conflict between that and antinatalism. If someone will come into existence, obviously, the presence or existence of that technology is not a reason to create them, if you get what I mean, like I said before. But let's continue.
Increases and becomes more sophisticated, there'll obviously be a market for selecting for traits that are more lifestyle-y, like intelligence and that sort of thing.
So it is already possible to, some companies say they can screen for this. Obviously, it is still a little bit experimental. Also, things like autism you can screen for to some extent, although people I've spoken about in the business say what you should just do if you're worried about autism is choose a female embryo. I mean, that's the other thing, that it allows you to choose the sex of your children. And yes, you can make the idea, you make a big batch of embryos, you screen them, you choose your sort of preference series, I suppose, and then you...
And see, there comes in like the selfish aspect of like, people would condemn designer baby technology because it's often catering towards the parent's preference. And people sort of see that as, some form of corruption, because I think people in some way, in a kind of twisted way, well, it's not twisted in there. I'll explain what I mean, but the randomness, even though it's not completely random, but the perceived randomness of creating someone and not manipulating their genetics in any way is essentially like a declaration that some people, I'm assuming people see it as like a declaration of like, I don't know what's going to come out, to put it in a crude way. But given the fact that I've accepted this randomness, perceived randomness, I am saying I will love whatever comes out of my womb, right, or my partner's womb. And I think people see that as a good thing, right? Because it's, all children should be loved equally. It doesn't matter who they are, how they are, blah, blah, blah. And so it's like, if you're introducing this ability to design your child to suit your preferences, that suggests that if they don't suit your preferences, unless you're able to make those changes, you may love them less, right? Because they don't suit your preferences as much. So, if I am going to have a child and I can manipulate them to be, better at piano or something, for the sake of argument, better at languages, this kind of suggests that because that's your preference, if they weren't as good at piano or weren't as good at languages, they wouldn't be as much to your liking, so you wouldn't like them less. So I think this idea of like the selfishness aspect of being able to sort of, design a baby, basically, it plays into this idea of like, not all children are worth loving. Some are more worthy of love than others, maybe. I'm not saying that's actually how it is, but I think that's maybe how people perceive it and why people have an issue with this whole like, parental preference thing. But again, what we've got to remember is like, why is any child created? Well, children that are voluntarily created, obviously there are children created out of force and stuff like that. I'm not talking about those cases, but it's like, is my volume not good? I can see the antenatal lope saying that they can't hear me properly, because I've got the stream up next to me and I sound pretty loud, so it may be on your side, antenatal lope. Anyway, what was I saying? Yeah, I can't remember, but yeah, basically, it just goes to show it's like, okay, my volume is way too low. I'll increase myself. Yeah, so basically, it goes to show, yeah, how like general procreation is also just self-serving. You are creating the child ultimately because you want to. Parents are not out there going, oh, you know, I really don't want to have a child, blah, 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 and then choose to create a child, right? If someone doesn't want a child and ends up having one, it's usually out of a coercion or something like this. But yeah, so, you know, procreation is ultimately self-serving anyway. So this sort of moral outrage over designer babies being self-serving, once you're an antinatalist, kind of seems a bit more ludicrous, because it's like, mate, it's all self-serving. Okay, I've still got people in the chat saying the volume's too low, but like I've literally got the stream up next to me. My phone volume is quite low, and I can hear the live really well. Yeah, so I'm not sure. I think if my volume's too low, people just need to put the volume up their end, because honestly, it seems fine my end, and I've got it up here. But cool.
Implanting that sequence depending on how many children you want to have. So it's not wildly different from the current IVF technology that's available. It just gives you greater knowledge about the traits that those embryos are likely to have as adults.
Yes, and I suppose it will be a little different. Mary, can you explain to me, do you think of this as just a normal, you know, a continuation of the technology we already have, a continuation of healthcare, or do you think there's something different in kind about it?
It's a difficult question to answer. I mean, in a sense, you know, the point Louise makes in her piece is correct in the sense that this is hardly the first intervention people have sought to make in, if you like, optimizing their children. You know, in a sense, you know, pretty much everything an averagely pushy, sharp-elbowed middle-class parent does is about optimizing.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's also like, you've got to remember that, like, before the child is born, there are a whole range of things that prospective parents do to increase, you know, the expected sort of welfare of their child is going to be in the future, right? Like, when a woman is pregnant, they often forgo, like, drinking, drugs, smoking. They will often try to eat healthier, take vitamins, all this sort of stuff, exercise. There are a whole range of things, and obviously people do things for and to their children after the children are born to improve their prospects. So it's like, it seems odd to draw this line along the genetic boundary, right? Obviously, I understand the whole, like, the practical aspects of, like, we don't know how this may, you know, downstream consequences, etc. But in principle, like, we do all sorts of things to influence, and we, like, intentionally do it as well. It's not like we just sort of do things and they happen to influence how our child is going to turn out. Like, we often go out of our way to quite a substantial degree to ensure that our child has as good a life as possible, at least in theory. A lot of parents actually don't do that, but yeah, so it's like, why would you draw the line at the genetic, you know, why would you draw it there on the genetic boundary? Again, having said all this, you know, I advocate people not to have children, but what I'm saying is, if someone is going to come into existence, I don't understand the moral outrage around designer baby stuff in principle. Like, the practical stuff I understand, but that's the case with any technology. But anyway,
using their children, and you know, if you've already set about optimizing all the way through the sociocultural stack, why would you not extend that down into genetics? So from that perspective, it's a difference. I mean, it's difference in kind in the sense that you're seeking to fiddle with biology. I think it's. I remain unconvinced that it's going that it will ever be as impactful as all that. I'd be surprised if it caught on widely, for the simple reason that most people, you know, given the choice, honestly, I think most women, given the choice between, you know, conceiving the old-fashioned way, assuming they like their husband, given the choice between conceiving the old-fashioned way and conceiving using a battery of medical professionals and some quite painful interventions, are going to choose the old-fashioned way because it's just much nicer. Yeah, why would you know? And weighing a set of abstract sort of genetic engineering considerations against that, you know, will probably sway some of the more rationalistic potential parents, potential mothers in particular, but for the rest, I would anticipate more of them than not continuing to recoil from that level of intervention. You know, given the far greater obvious appeal of doing things the old-fashioned way. So there's that. I mean, in terms of the effect I would anticipate it actually happening, I mean, I mean, I've argued elsewhere that we're already 50 years into the transhumanist era. So from that point of view, I don't feel like this is anything particularly new. To my eye, our tinkering with our own organism began with the contraceptive pill, and this is more of and from that perspective, this is more of a difference in degree, or a difference in sort of terrain, if you like, than a difference in kind. We've been setting out to fiddle around with what our organisms do for well over half a century. But also continuing along that line of reasoning, I think the evidence, the receipts from 50 years of tinkering with our organism through the medium of the contraceptive pill, as Louise's recent book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, very comprehensively showed, has not been as complete an abolition of the differences between men and women in the field of sexual desire, partner formation, and so on, as the original utopians anticipated. Men and women still exist; they still want slightly different things from an intimate encounter, notwithstanding the early promise of the pill to do away with all of that stuff and just let everybody play freely. Men and women still want slightly different things. Louise has made a very convincing case for that. And given this, I'm unconvinced that tinkering with our organisms in this way will succeed in abolishing genetic illness any more than the contraceptive pill succeeded in abolishing the differences between male and female sexuality. It might well displace them, but I doubt it's going to do away with them.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's understandable. I can see like people discussing the volume like so much in the chat, and I'm not exactly sure where it is at the moment. So I'm just going to continue because I think people can hear. So now I've lost my place. Where was I? What was she talking about? Let me go back and quickly see.
Any more than the contraceptive pill succeeded in abolishing the differences between male and female sexuality.
Oh yeah, this is it. So she's saying about how, this technology is not going to abolish, sort of genetic issues entirely, which is likely true. In reality, there are probably always going to be things because our genetic makeup is extremely complicated. There are always going to be, even if we can mitigate them like to a very large degree, let's say we can get rid of like 95% of genetically caused problems that are going to cause like significant harm to the child. One, we're never going to get rid of all of them. Two, this technology could at some point fall into the wrong hands and be used for evil rather than good. And three, as she says, we can displace some harms, but that may lead to unintended consequences of like causing other genetic harms. So you solve one, genetically sourced harm, some, horrible condition that someone may suffer from. But by altering their DNA, you cause an unintended consequence that causes another, genetic condition that they'll suffer from that's horrible. So it's like it could end up being that the medicine is worse than the illness kind of thing. And all of those things are real problems that could happen and just strengthen the case, in my opinion, of why would you create someone in the first place? Like, creating someone, part of the harms that they are... This is just part of the harms. Even if we solve the genetic question, right, the genetic part of things, there is still going to be, once someone is here, despite their genetics, things can happen to them. A war, being abused, all of these sorts of things that can happen to them. Also chronic diseases. So the fact that there's so much complication in reducing or eradicating, and we're never going to eradicate most likely, but reducing the harms on just the genetic level, just goes to show how blind the average person is, including the people on this panel, to the option of just, for ethical reasons, I'm not going to create another person. Do you get what I mean? It's like, we recognize that there are harms imposed or potential harms imposed on the children we're creating, because we're talking about them right now and talking about a technology that says it's going to alleviate it or solve it, right? And yet, whilst recognizing that we're going to be imposing these harms or risk of harms on someone, we continue to do it because we want to. And then we go, well, I've got this technology to make it slightly or to a more significant level better, but not completely okay. You know, what level of risk of cancer for a child is okay, right? Like, if you ask any parent, you know, is it acceptable for me to do something completely unnecessarily to your child right now to impose, you know, some risk of cancer on them, whether it's a large or small? The parent would say, no, fuck off. You're not putting any level of risk of cancer on my child. Like, that's not something that you have any moral right to do. And yet they do it to their own child by creating them. And the reason they do it is because they want to. Is because, not because they want to put that risk on the child, but it's because they want to create the child to satisfy their own desire of having a child or wanting a child, right? Knowing that it comes with all of those harms and those potential greater harms as well. So it's actually like an even worse case with people that discuss designer baby stuff, because it's like the discussion of designer babies is centered around some of the harms of coming into existence. So the people that are involved in these discussions are well aware of the fact that coming into existence imposes harms or the risk of harms on the child they're creating. So it's just mental, the fact that I haven't watched this whole, I did watch a bit longer than this before, but, you know, even like now or before, I haven't watched this whole video. They might mention antinatalism, but the fact that it wasn't the first thing that came up, and they just preface this whole conversation by saying, look, creating someone is imposing, you know, harm and the risk of great harm on them, and they are ultimately going to die as well. But we want to create people. And so within that framing, we're now going to discuss how we can reduce or alleviate or mitigate the harms imposed on the people we're going to be creating, because we think that's more responsible, not that it's responsible, but it's more responsible or less irresponsible than just going down the route of the biological crapshoot or the genetic crapshoot. Like, that to me would have been a more responsible framing of at the beginning of the conversation, because you're recognizing the elephant in the room straight away of the fact that you could just simply elect not to impose any risk of harm on your future child. But that's just my opinion. Let's continue.
You know, it might well displace them, but I doubt it's going to do away with them.
Yes, I mean, but at the same time, women do want different things, as Louise has explained, you know, in her book, but they can't necessarily have them now because the technology is precluding that.
Yeah, and I think one of the other sort of, you know, more speculative reflections I had about genetically engineering your children, to put it crudely, is that I wonder if what it would displace is not.
And there are 42 people watching at the moment. If you are, if you're watching and you haven't liked the stream already, please do. It helps push it out to more people. And also, given there's a decent amount of people watching, at some point I may run a poll and we can vote on something. Let's continue for a while, and then when something comes to mind, we can do a vote.
I wonder if what it would change is less the prevalence of, you know, undesirable, you know, to put it, you know, in the most brutal sense, undesirable, you know, unfortunate genetic illnesses, or, you know, less than ideal traits in one's children. I wonder if what it would change is more the envelope of what's considered tolerable. If it might do more to constrain the envelope of what a parent is willing to love in their children than it would actually.
Yeah, so this is the point that I was talking about before, right? Of like, people who are skeptical of designer baby technology, they're sort of, I think they see the perceived randomness as a form of acceptance that I will love anything that comes out of me, or out of my partner. But as she was saying, like, when we introduce designer baby technology, maybe this is going to decrease the range of, you know, acceptability of what a child can be and what is worthy of love, which, look, that is something like, I I understand the depths of depravity that humans can go to. So I would not put it past humans to stoop to the levels that she's talking about if this technology is introduced. I don't think that's necessarily a case for not using them at all. I definitely think there's a decent case to be made on moral grounds for using it in a way to mitigate potential harms to the child. It's much more murky when you talk about like starting to do, you know, changing hair color and stuff like this, where it is just a preference of the child or potential, you know, benefits to the child, stuff like that. Although I can kind of understand that, like if you were able to increase your child's IQ by 5 points or whatever, look, that probably would make the child better off once they're here, but it's a very murky territory. And yeah, it's just much simpler. Don't create them in the first place. You don't run into all these ethical problems. And you don't create a potential victim, you know, of all the things that you're hoping to mitigate in the first place. Right, before we continue, I'm going to create a poll. So let's see what we can do. Okay, I've got one. So in this poll, you forget about antinatalism. Sorry, I'm shit at multitasking. So let's say you're not an antinatalist, right? So forget antinatalism. The poll is going to be, if you were not an antinatalist and you thought it was okay to bring new people into the world, would you be for or against the introduction of designer baby technology? Let's create the poll now, see what people say. So let me know when you will continue. I'll let people vote on that for a bit. And then we will see what the results are. Eric is in the chat saying against. Eric, there's a poll which you can vote on, and welcome to the chat as well. Yes, but it's if you weren't an antinatalist. I'm assuming most people watching, if not everyone is watching, is an antinatalist. If you weren't, right? Because obviously everyone is going to say, well, just don't bring them into existence. But I'm saying if someone were to come into existence, you know, would you be for or against the implementation of designer baby technology, however you interpret that? And also, while people are voting on that, I'll welcome a few more people to the chat. So Eric, Aned's, Grey Ape, the horse, welcome to the chat. Are there any other new people? The man as well. The antenatal lope, I actually don't think I properly welcomed you. Wise Man is in the chat as well. Robert, Linda, hopefully I haven't missed anyone, but that's everyone I could see. Charlatan, hey, how you doing, Charlatan? Cool, okay, so let's see how the poll is going. So, okay. Oh, you guys can see that. Sorry, I hadn't changed my screen. So you can see how it's going. So, you know, most people are against. We've got about a third of people are for, 2/3 are against. There are 44 people watching, though, and only 19 people have voted. So I'll leave it a bit longer for people to vote. And if people want to, put their reasons for why they voted what they did in the chat. Bovine Blue Stocking is in the chat as well. Welcome to the chat. And Brit as well. Cool. Okay. Right. I'm going to leave you to vote a bit more. So let's continue.
Change the range of variation in the babies that are born.
Louise, do you worry about that? I mean, you mentioned that Down syndrome has effectively been, vanished in some countries, which is arguably good for the child. But it does, as Mary says, it narrows our limit of what we consider.
You know what's really interesting as well is that this whole concept of designer baby technology now allows us to sort of have a discussion as to what we would consider acceptable and unacceptable within a pro-natalist framing, obviously, because society is pro-natalist, but what we would consider an acceptable and an unacceptable imposition to put on a child, because Down syndrome is widely seen as something which is an unacceptable imposition to put on someone, right? But many like disability campaigners will say that actually, first of all, many Down syndrome people are, you know, happy. I've heard some people say that on average they may even be like happier, you know, than the average person. Ragsy is in the chat. Gingerbread Man is in the chat. So it's like, if you have someone with Down syndrome and, you know, the average like person who doesn't have Down syndrome, it actually like wouldn't be that clear that the person with Down syndrome has like a severe disadvantage, depending on who you're comparing them to, right? And so let me like give you an example. So like Down syndrome is seen as an unacceptable, and this can be the case for many disabilities, or what are seen as, you know, labeled disabilities. They can be seen as an unacceptable burden to put on someone, but they can actually be like much less of an imposition to put on someone than the capacity to suffer in and of itself. Like, if we think Down syndrome is such an imposition that we would use designer baby technology to wipe it out, not wipe out people with Down syndrome that already exist, I mean just make sure there are no more born, how does the capacity for suffering itself not meet that bar as well? Do you get what I mean? Because it's like, if Down syndrome is seen as a disability and an imposition, surely the capacity for suffering is also an imposition. Like, the average person who doesn't have Down syndrome could have a much, much worse life than someone with Down syndrome. We tend to draw these strong lines between different, like, you know, a normal person and a person with a condition, right? And for some conditions that makes sense, because there are some conditions that are just categorically horrible. But there are other conditions where it doesn't actually seem like there's a clear cut between the two categories, if you get what I mean. And I just find it interesting, right? It's like, yeah, the fact that we are willing to eradicate certain things we perceive as burdens, and yet we are just blindsided. Well, blindsided is the wrong word, but we're completely sort of like ignorant, or we ignore the fact that the capacity to suffer itself is a massive burden on someone. And to create someone is to put that imposition on them, to put that burden on them of living in essentially what is a meat suit that has the capacity for intense suffering. How is that not putting an imposition on someone to the same degree or much more than Down syndrome, for example? So anyway, we can actually, it's been a bit of time so we can see what the poll's saying. Okay, so we've got 26 votes. I'm now going to end the poll, so the results should publish in the chat. So we got 69 people. Well done, everyone. We got 69. 69 people said they would, if they weren't anti-natalist, they would still be against designer baby technology, and 30% said they would be for. So before I continue, I was going to say welcome to the chat, Brit, but I've already said that, haven't I? So now it'd be interesting to hear why people voted the way they voted in the chat, if you want to put it there. I'm not going to see everything, so if you'd like me to see, and you'd like everyone to see, and put it front and center, anything or why you voted the way you did, you can send in a super chat or a donation via the Streamlabs link. But yeah, thank you everyone who did vote, because that was interesting to see. To be honest, I was actually way off. I actually thought the majority of people would be for designer baby technology. Obviously, designer baby technology as a phrase, it skews negative because it's generally used as like a pejorative. I've completely lost my train of thought. Yeah, I lost where I was going with that. Fuck it. Let's continue.
Normal and acceptable.
Yeah, the slippery slope is very slippery. And I think, I mean, I write a bit in the piece about my own sort of personal considerations on this front. I mean, I'm currently pregnant with our second baby.
Yeah, congratulations.
Conceived the normal way, thank you. But I would potentially consider this for future babies. And the really, really strong argument.
Wouldn't consider just not creating them though, right? So that they just wouldn't have the risks of the things that you're trying to mitigate. Plus all the things that you don't even have the option of mitigating. This, you know, apparently either didn't occur to her or she thought, you know what, actually, no, I value my own desire to create a child above, you know, the welfare of my potential future child. Yeah, I don't know. Look, we just clearly like differ a lot on this. But yeah, I would not run that risk with someone else's well-being.
Argument for doing so is the disease argument. I mean, and I don't just mean diseases like Down syndrome, which are they can be life-shortening, but not dramatically. We're talking about that terror when you show up to the 12-week scan and you're thinking, goodness me, what are they going to find? Polygenic screening does remove that terror.
And that's crazy, right? The state of procreation now is you come inside me, we'll wait a bit, we'll go to a screening, and like who the fuck knows what we're going to find. Like that is the state of procreation at the moment, and anyone can do it. We just have like a laissez-faire. I'm not advocating for like any authoritarian like measures or anything like this. I'm just describing the state of play at the moment. This is not a prescription of anything. It's just describing the state of play. We have a complete laissez-faire. Anyone can have a child as long as they have the capacity to, and they can have as many as they want. And often they will be given money to do this, which is a whole nother conversation, very complicated. But it's like, that is the state of the world at the moment. That is the state of procreation. Like, this is the welfare of children we're talking about. And people can just go to a scan and be like, I don't know what the fuck we're going to find. And then if they if they find an issue, they can elect to just not do anything about it. This is the state of the world that we're in at the moment. It's actually, yeah, it's pretty mad.
Because you know exactly what traits the embryo has. It also removes the terror of things like, I don't know, childhood cancers. I mean, the list is so long of the horrible things that the lottery of DNA can throw up for your children.
But Louise has to remember that she entered them into the lottery in the first place. Like, this genetic screening technology she's talking about, 1, isn't perfect, 2, doesn't test for everything, and 3, like, many, if not most, of the things that can befall your child and are horrible are not touched by this, right? There are a whole range of things that can happen in the world that will, you know, be utterly shit for your child. And this technology has nothing to say about it. And yet, like, you still elect to enter your child into that lottery, right? They don't want to exist. They don't get to elect to do this. They don't get to, you know, they're not handed a contract and they get to peruse it and then sign on the dotted line if they think it's worth coming into existence or not. Obviously that can't happen. It's physically impossible. So she just decides, well, I want to do it, so I'm just going to do it. Like, ignore the fact that life is this massive thing that someone should be able to like sign on the dotted line for. And in my view, given that it's such a big thing and it should only be, someone should only be created after they've been able to, you know, with due attention and time, review what's going to happen beforehand and then elect to take on those risks and that burden themselves. But obviously that can't happen. But given that it can't happen, that doesn't just give you a blank check to decide for them. In my eyes, it means, well, you just don't have the right to create them then. It's not up to you. It's not like that's not a risk that you should be able to take on someone else's behalf. Do you get what I mean? It's like if there was someone on the other side of the world that I could not contact in any way, but I had the ability to choose whether something, you know, some massive risk could be put on their shoulders. Just because I'm not able to consult them doesn't mean that I just get a blank check to be able to decide to put that massive risk on them, right? I should just then say, okay, well, I just won't put that risk on them. I just won't create someone in the procreational circumstances. It's just crazy.
I think that parents are. I agree with Mary's point that most people are not going to jump at the necessity of having to go through IVF in order to do this. I think that this will appeal not just to the rich, but also to, yes, the rationalistic, the very risk averse. I think there are enough of those people to make quite a thriving industry out of this new technology, right? But the slippery slope is slippery. But the point that I ended up reaching, and the way I concluded the piece, is that in some senses we already have an incredibly artificial way of living, right? In that we have incredibly sophisticated medical technology, which can do things like cure childhood cancers most of the time, that can keep people with cystic fibrosis alive. You know, we have this amazing technology.
Why do they have cancer and why do they have cystic fibrosis?
Which allows us to fight against nature every day.
It's absolutely crazy. Like, she's literally reeling off a list of all the potential, like, horrible things that could happen to her child. And she continues to make them. And it's not just her, like, pretty much everyone. It's actually insane.
One of the problems with this down the line,
like how much people put satisfying their own desires above the potential, like, risks and the welfare of their future child. It's mad. And it's like, obviously parents will do things to secure the welfare of their future child, but not to the extent where they won't have them. Like, that goes too far, you know. Yeah, I'll make some accommodations and I'll do some things to secure the future welfare of my child. But if you ask me just not to create them so that none of the harms that I'm trying to mitigate do befall them, no, that's too much. Why is that too much? Oh, because then you don't get your desires fulfilled. Oh, okay, I see how it is. Okay.
Unfortunately, it's not a problem that we're encountering yet, is that it does mean that people carrying all sorts of horrible genes for horrible diseases are able to survive and reproduce, which is wonderful at the individual level. What it means at the genetic level long term is that you end up having a very kind of genetically sick population. And basically there are two ways out of this. One, we return.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't even thought of that. So, like, if you are able to have designer baby technology, just like with clothing, there will probably be fashion trends. And honestly, I would not put it past people to design their children by fashion trends. So there could be fashion trends in what types of people want to create. And then that can lead to a genetically sick population. That's interesting. I think I maybe had heard someone make that point before, but yeah, it hadn't really jumped to my mind when we were talking about it now. Yeah, that's an interesting... I mean, again, it just shows the complexity of this situation. And how it's just safe. I mean, one, there's just no benefit, but it's just safer not to create the child rather than put them into this ultra complex web of potential harms and then trying to mitigate those. Yeah. And it's just like, it's kind of crazy because she's like really emphasizing how complex and the magnitude and the variety of harms that can befall the child. And yet she still plans on, like, having more. Yeah, it's really bizarre.
To historic levels of child mortality. About 40% of children dying before the age of 15 is like our species norm. I do not want to do that. The other option is to find some other way of treating these conditions at the genetic level.
Well, no, hang on. There is also the option to just not create them. So she's presenting a false dichotomy here. A pretty mad false dichotomy. But yeah, no, you also have the option of just not creating them, and then you don't face any of these issues.
And this is one such way. I mean, CRISPR might also present another way in the future. And for me, that is the compelling reason to look kindly on this technology. But I am also very mindful that people are not just going to use it for those purposes. People are also going to try and create supermen out of their children.
Yeah, Mary, what do you think of that? That we've got this crumbling genome. I found this the most difficult moral problem. I know what I would.
Welcome to the chat, Jemison. And it's like, you know that like people do the most dumb shit. You know that people are going to use this technology in a bad way. If it is like liberalized and basically everyone has access to it, unless it's heavily restricted by a central authority, you know people are going to do immoral shit with it and like start commodifying their own people already commodify their own children, but it's just going to get to a whole new level. Like, just think about it. People use their children as part of TikTok trends already, right? People do all sorts of things to their children as a result of TikTok trends. Someone seriously tell me that people will not start, if this technology becomes widely available, someone tell me that people won't start using it to design their babies in a way that concords with TikTok trends or other social media trends, or as we were talking about before, fashion trends. People are definitely going to do that. And that is crazy. That is insane.
Choose on a personal level, but the crumbling human genome, do I have a duty to shore that up? Is this like the sort of Spartan hillside for the 21st century?
Well, two.
And yeah, the man in the chat makes a good point. How will you fully enforce it? People could crack in their vans. Exactly. So it's like once it's out there, even if it is heavily regulated by a central body, so are cigarettes. I mean, we have like, in my view, strict drug laws in this country, even stricter elsewhere, right? So it's like the government tries to restrict something like, let's just say something like cannabis, right? The government in this country like tries to, it has abolished it, has outlawed cannabis. You cannot use it for recreational use. It is in the UK available for medicinal use, luckily. But it's like, it's so common for people to use cannabis in this country, to the point where I don't even know what the law means anymore. Like, it's just meaningless in many ways. And so it's like, if that's going to happen with cannabis, it will probably happen with designer baby technology as well. People will be able to get around the laws and regulations and stuff like that. It's pretty crazy the lengths that people will go to essentially feel better or try and alleviate the bads that they've done by creating someone.
Points on that. When I only have one child, I had her relatively late, as these things go. I declined the nuchal fold test at 12 weeks because I didn't want, in the event that they found a possibility of a chromosomal abnormality, I didn't want to face the choice between having to abort a wanted baby, and I decided I'd rather just not know. And
so, sticking your head in the sand. So you've got a very serious ethical issue in front of you. You've created someone, not because they need to exist or they want to exist, but because you want to create them. And they're currently growing inside you, and you get the opportunity to run some sort of screening test that can show up some sort of abnormalities that will cause the child harm. And in response to that very serious, like, you've already put yourself in a serious ethical vice, right? Because you're creating someone already. And in response to that, you stick your head in the sand and choose, I don't want to know, just, what will be, will be. If my child is completely fucked over, well, that's the way it's going to be. How is that a moral way of responding to a situation like that in any way, especially when it's about a future child that you claim that you will love or you love already, is going to be the light of your life, the center of your world, all of this sort of stuff. It's crazy. It's actually mad. Christian is in the chat. Malik is in the chat as well. Welcome. Hopefully I haven't missed anyone else new in the chat.
Don't roll the dice. She's as you know. So that was my decision there. However, just recently, I was talking to a mum of a friend of one of my daughter's friends,
and Mr. Paul,
who had a child with a man who carries a rare genetic disease, you know, and he was already, his health was already affected by the disease when they were trying for a child. And I mean, she knows my work, and she knows I write a lot about bioethics and medical engineering and transhumanism and so on. She asked me point blank, in my
she must be aware of David Benatar and like other anti-natalists then.
shoes, what would you have done? She did IVF, and they did polygenic screening. And she said, in my shoes, what would you have done? And I thought about it and said very...
The lengths that people will go to, like knowing that even within the pro-natalist framework, your child is at an unusual risk of great harm. The lengths that people will go to just to create someone is insane. Like, you can simply not create them and run any risk with their welfare. But your desire to create someone is so strong, and it's so important for you to put your desires first, that you will go through IVF, which is not an easy process, to be able to reduce the risk of this great harm befalling the child, which you didn't need to put on them in the first place. It's absolutely insane. It's crazy how little regard people have for like the welfare of children in this situation. Like in any other, like these people are more like in the whole culture war paradigm of left and right. These two women, as far as I'm aware, fall on more like the sort of, you know, anti-woke, more conservative side. Not saying they are conservatives, I don't know, but they fall on that side of like the culture war stuff. And that side tends to be big on like, we care about children, we want to protect children. You know, the left are trying to harm children, blah, 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 you know, letting, you know, transgender people in toilets, or, you know, trying to trans the kids, or, you know, all of this sort of stuff, or they're trying to corrupt our children through the education system. Like, they say so much about wanting to protect children. And yet, when it comes to procreation, fuck it, I want to create a child, so I want to satisfy my desire. It's fine for me to put this child that I say I care about, and I say I care about children in general. And look, you do in other cases. You clearly care about children to some degree, but not to the degree where you just won't think about, okay, I'm going to forgo creating a child because it carries all these risks. They're going to die at some point. They'll live their life. They'll become attached to things, and then those attachments will be ripped away. Like, just not creating someone is too much of an ask for these people, because their desires have to come first. It's mental to actually care that you care, like to claim that you care about children, and then to ignore this issue and just steamroller ahead with satiating your own desires is mental. Yeah, crazy.
Honestly, I think I'd probably have done the same as you. I think it's an impossible question to answer. Well, I dare say there are committed Roman Catholics who can give you a very straight answer on that. I'm not a Roman Catholic, so it's something which I'm less scaffolded in.
Oh, so I can impose this massive risk on my child because my God says so. Okay.
Being able to wrestle with, and I have to be honest, I don't think I can give a confident answer. And in my friend's shoes, I probably would have done the same. However, I think Louise is right that people will try and tinker. I suppose the question, you know, the concern.
Surely, if you're in a situation where you like can't give a confident answer either way, and you know that one way you don't risk the welfare of a child and the other way you do, surely the responsible thing to do is not risk the welfare of the child if you don't know if it's the right thing to do or not. mental.
Concern for me is honestly less whether anybody's going to succeed in creating supermen. But I don't think it's possible to technologize our way out of our own nature. And I think the evidence to date from our efforts to do so suggests that if anything, it's counterproductive. When we try, it's just not possible to medically engineer ourselves into being something other than what we are. But I do think it's possible culturally, as a byproduct of that engineering, to make it less bearable to live with what we are. I think the evidence from 50 years of the pill is not that we've abolished men and women, but that we find it, or at least a minority of people now find it unbearable to be either male or female, because the promise of the technology is so radically at odds with what it delivers. And I think the likely outcome of a technology which promises, however effective it turns out to be, to abolish abolish illness, essentially abolish genetic illness, will be that on those occasions where inevitably, despite having been polygenically screened to within an inch of their embryonic lives, these babies then turn out to have some unforeseen medical condition. Their parents will find that intolerable. I mean, just if you look at the other end of life, I think that's part of what's driving the very sincere and obviously well-meaning push to legalize and to normalize euthanasia. It's not that people have
Oh, now we're going to get into a whole other topic.
Secretly and unconsciously want to murder their parents. It's straightforwardly that we're now so good at curing illness that incurable illness, which includes...
Who wants to murder their parents? I know she was saying that's not what people are doing, but why did that example come to mind? Are there like a very small minority of people who do want to murder their parents?
The inevitable decline in old age has just become unbearable to watch. It's come to seem such a horrific outrage that people are exerting the only form of control that's available within the medical paradigm at that point, which is to say,
I don't think people are advocating for the right to die and assisted dying because they're so much a snowflake that they can't bear to see anyone come to any harm. It's that if it makes sense at all for you to own your own life, and the case against slavery was that people own their own lives, not that your life can be owned by someone else. If it makes any sense that you own your own life, it is your property and no one else's, then for that to make sense, you have to have ownership over when and how it ends, right? Like, if you're forced to continue to exist against your will when you would rather die, then in no meaningful way do you own your own life. In no meaningful way. And that, I believe, is a fundamental case for the right to die and assisted dying. Now, obviously someone can say, okay, well, no one should be able to stop you, from, no one should be able to force you to continue to live. But assisted dying is asking us to facilitate you ending your life. Well, we facilitate people exercising their other rights, Why would we not facilitate this most fundamental one? It's one of the most fundamental aspects of life is that we die. Why is that the one that we wouldn't facilitate? What, because some people would fall through the cracks? And obviously that's very sad, but it's like people fall through the cracks of every system. Why is this unique here? Do you get what I mean? And it's like it's not that people are scared of seeing someone come to any harm or, suffer in any way. And so we'd rather them just be put out of their misery. It's the fundamental case I already gave, but like some people are in complete agony and there's no value to them in continuing to exist. Often this is people where, they're elderly, they're, the end of their lives anyway. They've got, some sort of chronic illness, something like that. No real prospect of it improving. Like those are commonly the people who are advocated for when we're talking about the right to die. That's not just someone being a snowflake and not being able to see someone come to any harm, right? Like these are people who seriously are requesting and will need to be, put out of their misery, their suffering. Yeah. I just don't understand these people who think it's fundamentally good to continue existing in all circumstances. Like that to me is just like fucking stupid belief that is born of ideology and twisted religious thinking. Clearly, continuing to exist in some circumstances is an awful thing to do. And yeah, forcing someone to continue to exist when they're in a shit situation with no prospect of it no real prospect of it improving, and they are electing to end their lives. I just don't understand what right someone else has to say, no, fuck you, you're going to continue suffering because of how I feel about your life. When it's not their life, it's your life. But because they feel a certain way about your life, they get to choose that you have to continue to suffer. Yeah.
We can't bear to watch you suffer, so we're just going to put you down like a dog.
There's a difference between how you perceive it from the outside.
But like saying put you down like a dog is trying to use that to frame it in a negative way. But what's wrong with putting a dog out of their misery? What's wrong with putting someone out of their misery, whether they're a dog or a human? So using this like speciesist language of trying to refer to dogs as lesser, even though I actually think dogs have better access to medical care in this case. Yeah, I don't know. It's crazy. Welcome to the chat, Fury. I don't know if anyone else is new. Oh, Riol as well. I think that's everyone who's new.
Unbearable. And when you talk to, older people who say, no thanks, I don't want to die. It's bearable,
Absolutely.
life is valuable, and that is true at the other end of life as well. We think, my God, I wouldn't want to, live with below average intelligence, or let alone a single cell disorder.
Right.
But the in itself
Indeed,
experience is valuable.
I can think of a great many disabled people who will say, who will stand up and say, excuse me, are you trying to tell me that my life was so not worth living that it should have been deleted before I was even born? I may have some difficulties, that require, the following things, but it sucks in some.
Well, she well, first of all, it would be interesting for her to read Benatar's book and then come back on that. But you can't delete a life that hasn't started yet. If she means abortion and the life has started in a morally relevant way, then obviously that's a different thing. But if she's talking about, like they were talking about IVF and discarding certain, fertilized eggs that, would carry something that we would judge for their life not to be worth living, or starting even in the pronatalist sphere. Like, in that case, you can't delete a life that hasn't started yet. Like, they're not sentient. They're not in existence in any morally relevant way. They can't think, feel. They're not an individual. You're not deleting them. Abortion is a separate issue, because then someone has come into existence already, depending on how far along the fetus is. Yeah, and it's like, even then, there may be a case to say, yeah, their life is going to be so shit that it is worth making a call on their behalf, given that at the state they're in at the moment, they may only have minimal, perception, whether positive or negative, and they may have some genetic abnormality where we know that they're going to have an awful life. Why would you put someone through that? Oh, because they can't exercise their autonomy? Well, what real form of autonomy is that? If depending on the condition, obviously, but if they have such, like, one of those conditions where it's just awful, cluster headaches from a very young age or something like this, or a hole in their heart so they die, within a few days, like, how ideological would you have to be to say, no, we have to let them exercise their autonomy? What fucking autonomy? They have no autonomy in any real sense.
But I'd rather be here than not.
You mentioned in the beginning of the piece that you have certain traits, that you think of as negative. Would you now, if you could click your fingers and disappear them, imagine that your own parents had done some, polygenic screening? Would you eliminate those traits?
Well, the question is, would I not come into existence, as I am?
No, would you just...
Because that's kind of the only way.
Kind of, but let's imagine you could do it.
Well, that's also a difficult question for people to tackle, right? Of like, because antinatalists get asked that all the time, right? About like, well, you know, would you prefer not to have been born? And it's very hard for people to, I don't think it's that hard for antinatalists to answer, but I think the average person will find it quite hard to answer, because generally they will be, even though they're being asked, would it have been better if you weren't born? What they're actually usually thinking about is, would it be good for me to be taken out of existence now? Because they're thinking about it as someone who already exists. So they already have their desires, their attachments, a life that they know and want to continue. And so they're thinking, well, I won't have that anymore. But what it actually is, what may be a more sensible way to ask the average person this is, 1,000 years ago, were you worse off in some way or harmed in some way for not having existed? Or how was that year for you? You know, the year 1066. Now the average person would probably go, well, that question doesn't even make sense, right? Because I didn't exist to perceive anything. You know, the year was nothing to me. I didn't exist. So it's like that probably gets at what's really being asked in a better way. Because when you ask someone if they would prefer not, if it was better for them not to be born, they're usually thinking about it in, oh, would it, you know, if I'm taken out of existence now rather than never be brought in.
Through CRISPR or something like that, rather than just have those traits been net valuable to you, or would you have liked to be without them?
No, I'd be happy to delete them. But I do take Mary's point, though, that everyone is in some sense, shall we say, genetically flawed, at least from someone's perspective. Everyone has some kind of trait which is considered undesirable. And moreover, that we can become sick and disabled in manifold ways which have nothing to do with genetics. We could all be, you know, run over by a truck and then left permanently disabled by that. So we have to find, this is part of life, we have to find a way of coping with that fact and loving and caring for people regardless of it.
What would be interesting as well is I'm just thinking, everyone in the chat, if you put in the chat where you're from, it would be interesting to see where everyone is from around the world. Put the name of the country or the flag or wherever. If you're in the UK, say where in the UK you are, because that'd be interesting. I mean, obviously you don't need to put a street name, but yeah, that'd be interesting. John H is in the chat as well. Welcome, John.
Not sure that that means, therefore, I mean, I think that the moral...
So we've got NYC, New York City in America. We've also got Philadelphia in America. We've got Canada. We've got, there's a few flags that are like that. Zuzi, is that Poland? I know Indonesia has a flag like that as well. We've got Trinidad and Tobago. Very interesting. Rule in Trinidad and Tobago. Are there any other antinatalists there? Is there anything antinatalist related that happens there? Because it's not a country, you know, that at least people in like the UK, you know, it's not a country that really comes to mind that much. So that'd be like really interesting to hear. Louis on the East Coast of America. We've got MP. Welcome to the chat. Sydney, Australia. Robert, NYC. We've got a few NYCs. No, we got two NYCs. We got Kansas, Finland, the horse in Finland. The most recent episode of Antinatalism Around the World was for Finland. So definitely go check that out. It's only a few videos back. South California, sorry, we've got Susie, yes, Poland. Okay, cool. There's also an episode of Antinatalism Around the World on Poland and America, for any of the people from America. We've got Switzerland, which is Elias. Welcome to the chat, Elias, as well. 3 NYC people. Cool. Okay, nice. Let's continue.
Challenge, which we don't currently have, or which we will, I think, soon have when this becomes routinely available and more affordable, is to say, I could make sure that my child does not have this trait. I have that available to me. And
Buddha's from India. Great to have you. The horse says, thanks for the tip, probably Hyrie. Yes, so the Finland episode is Matti Hairi and the translator of the Finnish version of an antinatalist handbook, which was very cool, Wera. And Rule says, well, in population 1.5 million, there must be at least one other antinatalist, but there hasn't been any conversations. And I haven't ever met another antinatalist. That's interesting, though. 1.5 million. I actually didn't realize that the population of Trinidad and Tobago was that high. But that's interesting. There probably will be at least one other. I guess it would just be a case of like, well, there might be like child-free groups in Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know, but there might be someone like Facebook. That's probably the best place to start if you're trying to find people. Or another good place to start is vegan groups in Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know if there are any vegan groups, but often there's a big overlap between veganism and antinatalism. So if anyone is looking for other antinatalists in their country, generally child-free groups or even better vegan groups, those are usually the places to look. We've also got Anna in Portugal, and Anna couldn't see the start of the stream. No worries at all, Anna. And welcome to the chat as well. Don't Watch My Vid is UK based and also welcome to the chat. Whereabouts in the UK are you? So Don't Watch My Vid, not this coming weekend, not next weekend, but the weekend, Anyway, the last weekend of June, whenever that is, the last weekend of June, we're having a big antinatalist weekend in London where we're going to Pride as a group. Nimrod is doing a mini tour and then he ends in London. So we're going to Pride and carrying some supportive signs that also sort of hint at antinatalism. Then we have a social on the Saturday evening, and then we're doing Speaker's Corner for outreach on the Sunday. So, Don't Watch My Vid is in London. Are you in the London group already? Because maybe I'm talking to someone who's already coming. But anyway, if you're not part of the London antinatalist community, then email me and I can add you. And we're doing a big antinatalist weekend on the last weekend of June, which will be great. So you should definitely come and join us for that. Alias says video on the Scopsy. At some point I will do one. As part of the History of Antinatalism series. But I haven't got around to it yet. Based Sasha is in Utah, originally from Ukraine, and also welcome to the chat. Cool. I don't think there's any other. Yes, Don't Watch My Vid. Yeah. Email me. I'll add you to the community. There's a bunch of us, and yeah, we're doing a big weekend, and we meet up every few months. So definitely come be part of that. Cool. Okay, let's continue.
I think it's very difficult as a parent to say, but I'm going to go ahead anyway and burden them with this trait. And again, I'm not necessarily talking about something like Downs, which people can live very happily with. I'm thinking of the really horrible things. Tay-Sachs disease is one example of a particularly horrible genetic disease.
But people do it anyway. And also just the capacity for suffering, like Louise is willing to put that on her child. So it's like she's kind of coming across as having more consideration than the average person, and she does have more consideration than the average person. But even the people like her who have more consideration than the average person still put their own interests above the interests of their potential child, right? Their future child. Absolutely crazy. Tyler Johnson's in the chat. Vegan Runs is in the chat as well.
Which arguably has been the subject of eugenic interventions, right? Because it's overrepresented among Ashkenazi Jews, and there's been efforts to basically pair up couples such that they're unlikely to have children with Tay-Sachs. That's a horrendous disease. And I just think that it's very unlikely. I think trying, not that we can, and not that Mary's proposing that we do either, but trying to thwart this technology because of the concerns we have about how it could be misused, which I'm very sensitive to, I think in the end would be wrong. I ended up concluding the piece, deciding that actually this type of biotech I'm okay with. I'm not okay with a lot of other types of biotech, as I've written in Spectator before, but this one.
And you think that even in terms of enhancing lifestyle traits?
That's the difficult one because people will use it for that purpose.
Yeah, I mean, they already are.
Yeah. And in
people
practice,
can select,
of course,
males and females. And I know Mary doesn't think it'll be ubiquitous, but I honestly think, given fertility rates and the extent to which people are now doing kind of IVF and embryo screening, it's inevitable that we'll be choosing, especially at the people with a lot of money will and already are choosing.
Yes. And one of the things that, say, Jonathan Anomaly, who's a philosopher who writes about this subject, one of the things that he warns against is the possibility of speciation, which is a fairly terrifying word, that you can have this kind of runaway effect with some elites using this technology and making their children.
It's a bit like Elysium, if anyone's seen that film. Like, not in the genetic manipulation, or maybe they do that, but it's just the case that the rich get this technology to go to space, and there's just runaway, like their lives are just amazing, and there's only a few people there, and then there's the, everyone else down on Earth, which is really like poor and living in squalor. I'll have to watch that film again, actually.
So, extraordinarily tall, for instance. I mean, because people are going to routinely select for height in their sons, for instance. So one of the effects, I can't remember if I mentioned this in the piece, but one of the likely effects of people using this at scale would be to have much greater difference in average height between boys and girls, because people will select for height in their sons and not typically their daughters. And so you can really, it doesn't take that many generations of doing this sort of thing to start to see these effects in the wider population. And I find that scary and sinister. And maybe the Catholic position is right and God will punish us for this in one way or another. But in the here and now, I can't say no to the use of...
You wouldn't select that trade?
Not on the height thing. Well, I say now, when you're actually presented with a suite of embryos.
You have to tick
exactly. But I think when it comes specifically to the preventing terrible diseases,
I think that's quite.
I can't reject this technology. No.
Yeah, Mary, what do you think about lifestyle traits? Would you say you had everyone is presented with a kind of readout? Would you not tick a few boxes and say, I'll have this embryo or that, or even in a CRISPR world, whether you'd select for a little gene editing? Wouldn't you think you'd be letting your child down?
It's sort of hard to say, isn't it? Because I mean, it's also worth pointing out, it's also worth emphasising that gene coding and gene expression are two different things, and I think there's a
so the complexity gets even more. It's even stronger case just not to throw someone into this complex web of things in the first place.
Common popular misunderstanding, and I'm not attributing this to you, Louise, to be clear, but in when people talk about these kinds of technologies, there's a common sort of popular misunderstanding of what genes do, which suggests that it's just sort of a programmable code that will reliably produce a specific result. And that's to the best of my understanding, and I've checked this with a couple of geneticists who understand that much better than I do, and proper scientists. I asked, as I understand it, what genetics do is more like offer a range of possibilities which will express differently depending on the circumstances. So, I mean, it's plausible in that context that you could select an embryo which has a greater likelihood of high intelligence. But if that child grew up in an environment where this was for some reason not a helpful attribute, it's possible that or for some unforeseen reason to do with the environment, it might well not be as pronounced as might have been expected from the coding. There are all sorts of ways that gene expression and gene coding can produce unpredictable results. So I think it's all very, to imagine that we can select our children from a range of, a bit like picking an avatar in a computer game. I don't think it's ever going to work like that. And it's plausible that what we might see is a kind of displacement of the ways in which the scions of extremely rich parents can disappoint their parents, is displaced from academic achievement to gene expression. If you see what, so you send your son to rugby, expecting him to be captain of the football team and top of the class, and actually he turns out to be the moron at the back, who just spends all of his time getting into trouble. These things happen. And I think I imagine we're sorry. You can excise the word. You can excise the word moron from that. I'll probably get cancelled for that. Okay, yeah. But you understand what I'm saying. I think we may well end up with people who sort of edit furiously for genes only to discover that actually that's not what they got after all. I mean, who can say what consequence that would have for your relationship with your children? If you imagine you can control them even down to the level of genetic expression, that's even more nightmarish for the wayward son of the super rich than being sent off to rugby when actually.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, it adds another layer of complexity with the relationship with your child, because it's like now there's sort of like the average person will look at their parents and not see them as fully responsible for how they turned out, because there's an element of, like I said, perceived randomness and stuff. But if you're able to design your child, that child is then born, they know that you were able to pick and choose how they were. And so if they don't like it, then holding you responsible will be an easier avenue because of the increased level of agency or control they had over the details. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, of how like it, you know, impacts the sort of parent-child relationship. Yeah, that's interesting.
What you really want to do is become a fitness coach,
Yeah.
you know, which also sometimes
not only are you, creating a different class of children, but you're creating a very unhappy class of super bright, super tall kids who've let their parents down nonetheless because they failed in some way to, you know.
eminently possible.
Yeah.
But I mean, just sort of at the other end of things, you know, in the short term, I completely see the force of your argument, Louise, about, you know, I wouldn't be able to turn down the possibility of you know, twiddling with the dials in this way, even if in the long term it runs the risk of speciation. I mean, arguably speciation already happens and is already very noticeably happening. You know, meritocracy has unleashed several generations of assortative mating upon the world, such that I would say, you know, cognitive stratification has already happened to quite a marked degree between socioeconomic classes, with potentially, you know, accelerating and concatenating future consequences. I mean, that's possibly a separate rabbit hole. But I mean, this is, you know, what we're talking, the speciation that we're talking about is already happening, you know, even without the genetic component. But I suppose my reflection on genetic tinkering and its relation to eugenics is, if you look at the whole picture holistically, my working hypothesis on theoretically eugenic reproductive technologies is that the ones which promise to be able to allow us to ameliorate ourselves in theory end up having the opposite effect in practice. And I mean, to offer a slightly provocative example, the original advocates for birth control argued in favor of legalizing and propagating birth control on the basis that, quote unquote, on eugenic basis. I mean, Marie Stopes and Margaret Sanger and people like that were vociferous progressive eugenicists who argued that this was a mechanism whereby defectives and, you know, and dysgenic remnants could be eliminated from the population, and we could sort of breed ourselves into a superior state of collective felicity as a species. And that's not what happened. Actually, the opposite has happened. I mean, I'm on dangerous territory here, so I'm going to tread as carefully as I can. But let's just say the people who are not having children now are that they're not the people that Margaret Sanger anticipated would stop having children. If anything, it's still around.
Yeah, the genome is crumbling still.
Yeah, the genome is crumbling still, and I mean, if the people most likely to put off having children are the women with the highest levels of education. The women most likely to not have children or not have as many children as they'd like are the most highly educated women, which is more or less the opposite of what Margaret Sanger was hoping was going to happen. So, you know, I don't take a political stance on this, but this is really just to illustrate the fact that a technology which was eugenic in theory has turned out to be quite the, you know, really not that in practice.
Yeah, so it's just another reason not to bring someone into this world, because like all of the fallout of this, like why would you add someone else to that so that they can experience it as well?
And I don't. If you look at holistically the whole picture, including its concatenating cultural impacts, you know, not just beyond the narrow confines of the technology itself. If you look at the totality of the impact of legalized birth control, it has had the opposite of the effect that Margaret Sanger argued it would. And I don't know the mechanism yet, but I predict that should genetic engineering technologies, polygenic embryo screening, and so on become normalized and widespread, something similar will obtain. It will be eugenic in theory, but it will turn out by some perverse broader cultural mechanism to be dysgenic in practice. I don't know what that is yet, but when it happens, I'll pop up and say, "Told you so."
Thank you, Mary, for that terrifying thought.
Remember me.
I can see the Frankenstein coming towards us. And thank you, Louise, also for the optimism and all the food for thought. And congratulations and good luck with your baby, Louise.
Thank you.
And thank you both very much. Fascinating and terrifying conversation.
For the potential cancer victim. Okay, so that is that. That was that clip from The Spectator with Louise Perry and Mary Harrington. So I'll be putting the link to that in the description when we finish. But I just wanted to say thank you everyone for joining, engaging in the chat, voting on the poll when we did it. And we can end it there. If you have any thoughts post-stream, please put them in the comments once this stream is up. But the lengths that Natalists will go to satisfy their own desires. It's insane, but it's a reality. Anyway, thank you everyone for joining, for watching, and I will see you in the next one.